This essay example, as well as thousands of others, is available in text format on our website for free and without registration. Simply Google Ivy Panda Free Essays.
Introduction. Today, people build their society and relations in it on the principles of ethics, which were developed by such philosophers as Socrates and Aristotle in ancient times. One of the main principles on which the ethical school is based is the notion of virtue as the representation of the moral perfectness of a man. Moreover, virtue can also be defined as the way that a man should follow to live a better life that is full of light and goodness. Socrates and Aristotle are considered the founders of the ethical principles. Socrates was the first who determined the notion of virtue, and Aristotle developed his own vision with basing on Socrates' viewpoint. Thus, there are many similarities in the philosophers' interpretation of virtue. Still, there is also a significant difference in their approaches to the discussion of virtue, which is influential for the organization of their ethical systems. This critical difference determines the source of virtue as the moral category. Socratic virtue. Socrates considers virtue as the basis for understanding people's morality. Virtue can be thought of as the complex of the best human qualities and traits which he develops consciously. Socrates determines four main virtues which exist in people's lives. They are prudence, or personal wisdom, justice, temperance, and fortitude. Following these four virtues is the men's chance to live a better life because they are connected with all the aspects of people's lives, including civil life and military service. However, a man cannot consciously follow the principles of a virtuous life when he does not know them. That is why to live a moral life, it is necessary to know what the virtue is. Having determined four main virtues, Socrates states that prudence can be considered the major one, which is the source for developing justice, temperance, and fortitude. His arguments depend on his opinion that prudence, or wisdom, is associated with human intelligence or reason, and intelligence is knowledge. Thus, Socrates understands virtue and the way to it as knowledge. According to Socrates, the real morality and virtue are the knowledge of what is good and what is wrong. Understanding virtue as good is the way to reach a person's moral satisfaction and live a happy life. A man can acquire virtues such as prudence, justice, temperance, and fortitude when he spends a lot of time learning and perceiving the world around him and developing himself. The human's perception is his knowledge about oneself and reality. Learning to live a virtuous life is possible as people learn other norms and rules. Socrates considers virtues and the moral norms and rules which are based on them as eternal and unalterable. Analyzing Socrates' visions of virtue, it is possible to say that he understands knowledge as the source for developing virtues and main prudence as the reflection of a person's intelligence. Aristotelian virtue. Aristotle develops Socrates' principles associated with the notion of virtue and presents his own structure of human moral categories, which form ethics. Thus, Aristotle understands virtue is the balance or golden mean between two possible extremes in actions and thoughts. That virtuous person should know where this golden mean is and act according to it to achieve the goal of living a happy life. Happiness is the notion that Aristotle combines with the idea of virtues because virtue is the human's way to happiness and part of happiness as the whole one. Happiness as a result of following a virtuous life is also part of the person's life when his mind controls his will, feelings, and emotions and points out the excellent way to happiness. Moreover, Aristotle determines much more virtues that influence people's life. They are liberality, truthfulness, friendliness, forgiveness, integrity, and some others which form the person's morality. According to Aristotle, all the virtues can be divided into intellectual and moral. Thus, intellectual virtues are affected by the people's wisdom and their will to follow them. Moral virtues are connected with the emotional nature of humans. They depend on the people's desire, will, and motives to realize them. Virtue is the moral category that can be considered the motivation for a person's actions and behavior. Therefore, Aristotle understands a person's will, desire, and motivation as the primary basis for virtue, but not knowledge. Aristotle versus Socrates. Socrates and Aristotle developed the knowledge of virtue as goodness and the combination of the person's best traits, but their approaches to the issue of the source of virtues are quite opposite to each other and form the main difference in their visions of virtue as the moral category. Socrates' opinion that knowledge is the single source of virtue is argued by his successors. The idea that virtue is knowledge of what the agent's good is, and the agent's good is knowledge, is somewhat controversial because it appeals only to the rational in humans and rejects the fact of their emotional causes for actions. Socrates does not differentiate between knowledge and its usage. He considers that a person can misbehave without following the principles of virtuous life only because he does not know these principles. This opinion can be considered rather idealistic because it rejects the natural peculiarities of people's behavior based on the practical part of the personality. Aristotle's vision of the virtue's source can be considered more realistic than Socrates. He is the first philosopher who develops moral principles by focusing on the voluntary aspect of personality. Knowledge has a general character, and the action results from a personal will. Being influenced by knowledge, virtues, and morality depend on the will and desire to live a virtuous life. It is possible to know what is good, but it is essential to want to follow goodness. It is important to notice that a person who has knowledge about virtues can have no desire to develop them and to follow them even if she knows these moral principles. That is why Aristotle's theory of virtue is relevant to contemporary life in detail, not just in general approach. Aristotle's viewpoint that virtues and action are the effects of a person's will can be considered more plausible in comparison with Socrates' idea on the rational character of virtues. Conclusion. The notion of virtue is the fundamental category of ethics that was developed by Socrates and Aristotle. The main principles of virtues provided by these philosophers have many similarities in relation to virtue as the moral category, but the main difference is in Socrates' and Aristotle's vision of the source of virtue. Socrates presents the idealistic visions of goodness depending only on knowledge, while Aristotle examines all the aspects of this notion and focuses on the voluntary factor. Aristotle's idea can be considered more reliable because it depends on the natural characteristics of personality. If you want to find more works like this essay on Aristotle versus Socrates, the main difference in the concept of virtue, head over to ivypanda.com. It has a collection of free samples with thousands of submissions covering virtually all academic subjects. No registration required to access it.